is Peacebuilding, Conflict Resolution and Dialogue Theory. We have our moderator here, Vanya Womack, and the distinguished guests as well on the panel, and we hope you enjoy the session. Thank you very much.
All right, so welcome to another session here. I am not Professor Swasti Rao. I'm Vanya Womack, the original moderator that's in your program. I was not able to be here. So I'm Vanya Womack again. I'm with Villanova University in Political Science. So it's a real privilege, I believe, for all of us to gather here in India for this conversation on peace building, conflict resolution, and dialogue. Subjects that feel especially relevant in a country defined by deep diversity, democratic negotiation, and a long tradition of leadership through change. India's experience reminds us that peace is not sustained by institutions alone, but by relationships, but by the everyday work of living with difference. So we're meeting at a moment of growing democratic fragmentation across the world, where polarization and mistrust are fraying the social fabric of many societies. And in such times, dialogue is often dismissed as too slow or too idealistic. Peace is built not through quick solutions, but through long-term commitments to human connection. So this panel explores dialogue as a lived practice through peace building, conflict resolution, and dialogue theory. So to guide us through these teams, we're joined by an exceptional group of panelists whose work bridges theory and practice and lived experience, as I mentioned, and it's my honor to introduce you to the panel. And since I just got up here to moderate, I'm going to let them introduce themselves when they come up. Just say your name and your association, who you're associated with. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers very warmly for the invitation and for making this conference possible. It is a real pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity to speak in such a wonderful and hospitable country, and I very much look forward to the discussions and dialogue that will follow during this conference. Let me begin with a short story told by Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, which, by the way, also can be found in Jainism. We visited a temple yesterday, and there we learned that. It is described that a group of people is entering a dark room where an elephant is standing. Because it is completely dark, no one can see the whole animal. Each person touches a different part. One touches the trunk and says, "It looks like a snake." Another one touches the leg and says, "No, this is a tree." A third touches the ear and insists it is a fan. Very quickly, they begin arguing, passionately and sincerely, each convinced that their own perception is correct. In Jainism, this illustrates Anikantevada. It means that it is not mystical, it is a structural problem. Conflict does not arise because people are ill-intentioned. It arises because each person experiences only one fragment of reality and mistakes it for the whole. I begin with this story because many contemporary democracies increasingly resemble this dark room. Perception fragments, trust erodes, and coexistence becomes fragile. Before I continue, let me briefly explain how my analysis is structured. Given the limited time, I will focus on 7 core theses derived from my research and will not go into detail, but only briefly outline the main topics. This presentation is guided by 3 questions. First, how did endemic polarization in Turkey shape Hizmet's civic repertoire? Second, how did this repertoire travel and transform in the German institutional environment? And third, what challenges and potential emerge from this adaptation process for civil Islam and democratic democratic resilience. My analysis draws on four main strands of social science: polarization research, civic repertoire theory, institutional adaptation, and transnational perspectives. Together, these approaches form the analytical foundation of the work. This presentation is only a short summary. It is not a comprehensive history of the movement, nor an exhaustive theoretical analysis. My aim is to highlight the most important issues concerning polarization, civic engagement, and democratic resilience today. Let me start with my first thesis. Polarization does not only undermine democracy, it also shapes kinds of civic practices that emerge. According to Jennifer McCoy, an American political scientist, it is crucial to distinguish between ideological and effective polarization. Ideological polarization concerns policy disagreement and is largely manageable. But effective polarization is different. Political opponents are seen as moral enemies. This erodes trust, undermines cooperation, and political opponents are seen as moral enemies. This erodes trust, undermines cooperation, weakens deliberation, and normalizes zero-sum logic, where compromise appears as betrayal. To understand this, let's have a look at Turkey, where Hizmet developed. Turkey illustrates what happens when polarization becomes persistent rather than episodic. Since the founding of the Republic in 1923, political life has been shaped by deep and overlapping conflicts between secular and religious identities, around the Kurdish question, through repeated military interventions, and through weak protection of minorities. These conflicts did not simply create disagreement, they institutionalized distrust. Repeated coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1997 reinforced the belief that civilian politics was too dangerous to be trusted. Over time, polarization becomes structural rather than temporary. Political opponents were no longer seen as legitimate competitors, but as an existential threat, and compromise was seen as betrayal. Under these conditions, democratic norms erode, civil discourse deteriorates, the public sphere becomes more confrontational and less deliberative, and political competition slips into zero-sum logic. This, in turn, lowers the cost of authoritarian consolidation. Democratic institutions can be hollowed out without triggering broad cross-sectoral resistance. Hizmet had to experience this in Turkey for the last years, Armenians, Kurds, and Alevis, other minorities in Turkey, for much more years. In this sense, the Turkish trajectory offers a clear warning for Western democracies. It shows what can happen when effective polarization is left unattended too long. My second thesis follows directly this context. Hizmet emerged not as a political project, but as a civic response to polarization. Hizmet has chosen the way of a civil Islam and not the way of political Islam, like other Muslim actors did in Turkey. Thus, beginning in the late 1960s, Hizmet developed a repertoire based on three pillars: education, dialogue, and service. I won't go into details since this is already topic of other presentations. Importantly, these practices did not seek political power. They sought cooperation in an environment where politics was perceived as dangerous. In this sense, Hizmet reflects what Max Weber described as an ethic of responsibility, in acting in ways that preserve social cohesion even under adverse political conditions. My third thesis is bridge building is an alternative civic logic of Hizmet. This slide illustrates just how broad Hizmet's bridge building efforts were in Turkey across different contexts. One image shows the Mosque Cemevi project, a joint worship and community center created to bring Sunni and Alawi communities in the same space for shared prayer and for social interaction. Another picture shows Gülen meeting with artists, public figures and politicians. You see the pictures of Fethullah Gülen with religious leaders and with leaders of different minorities. A series of conferences and forums dealt with topics that were often ignored in the mainstream political sphere, such as the relationship between Islam and democracy, religion and politics, freedom of expression and freedom of speech, or human rights, or, for example, the cultural and political rights of Kurds. The tutoring center pictured in the bottom row was located in the southeastern Turkey and was established to give Kurdish children academic support and opportunities that might keep them from being drawn into the PKK's terrorist violence. Together, these images represent only a small selection of the movement's activities. They exemplify Hizmet's strategy of cheating diverse civic platforms that cross ideological, religious, and ethnic boundaries. Taken together, these initiatives generated what Robert Putnam famously called bridging social capital, social ties that connect groups rather than reinforce divisions. My fourth thesis may sound counterintuitive to you. Repressions did weaken Hizmet, yes, but it also transformed and expanded its civic capacities. From 2013 onward, and especially after 2016, Hizmet faced systematic repression in Turkey. Many members were forced into exile. This diaspora phase brought about several important changes. First, the movement began to modernize. Members developed new skills in advocacy, public communication, research, and coalition building. For example, with other minorities in Turkey, like Kurds, Alawis, or other groups. Second, self-definition became unavoidable. Identity and mission could no longer be taken for granted and had to be clearly articulated. We see this, for example, in the Hizmet values document that was presented in the panel just before. And third, alliances become essential. Dialogue was no longer mainly symbolic, it became a form of protection. And here, Hannah Arendt's insight is very relevant. Power emerges from the ability to act in concert. In exile, acting in concert across religious and civic boundaries became a condition of survival. My fifth thesis brings me to Europe and Germany and their polarization context. The map on this slide illustrates how widespread authoritarian populist sentiment has become across the continent. It ranks countries by the percentage of voters who expressed authoritarian populist views. According to these figures, we see Romania, Poland, followed by France, the Netherlands, and Finland. Sweden, Spain, and Germany have comparatively lower levels, but the picture underscores that no Western democracy is immune from this trend. In presenting this data, my point is not to demonize any specific country, but to contextualize the rise of populist and authoritarian ideologies across Europe. This helps explain why discussions about democratic resilience and the role of civil actors like Hizmet have become more urgent, especially in countries where trust in democratic institutions is relatively fragile and populist ideas have gained traction. As I said, Germany is not immune to the forces reshaping politics across Europe. In recent years, we have seen growing support for populist parties, most notably the AfD, along with an increase in identity-based conflicts and the rise of digital echo chambers that amplify extreme views. At the same time, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are on the rise, and public trust in political parties is declining. The bar graph on the slide captures the social consequences of this escalating polarization. Taken together, these trends point to the social consequences of growing polarization. While Germany's situation is not yet comparable to the Turkish experience, the pattern of fragmentation is familiar and resembles its early stages. This raises an important question. How can civic initiatives like Hizmet intervene early to strengthen democratic resilience before polarization becomes deeply entrenched? My sixth thesis is the turn of Hizmet in Germany to German. After 2016, Germany became more and more important for Hizmet. This was enabled by Germany's constitutional protections, strong civil society, and post-migrant social structure. Over time, Hizmet evolved from informal initiatives into foundations, platforms, and professional networks. A large, well-educated migration wave significantly expanded civic capacity. But from the first day in the 80s, Hizmet had to face different challenges. Informal organization habits with expectations of transparency, low visibility, limited public recognition, Turkey-centric framing persisted. But this is all changing quickly. My last and seventh thesis is Hizmet's importance in Germany lies in its civic relevance and democratic resilience. Despite these challenges, Hizmet's relevance in Germany lies in its non-political civic contribution. It fosters bridge-building social capital, interreligious cooperation, civic education, humanitarian engagement, and a form of civil Islam that treats faith as a civic resource rather than a political project. Initiatives such as the House of One in Berlin exemplify this approach. The House of One is an interfaith project that brings a church, a synagogue, and a mosque together under one roof with shared spaces for dialogue and community life. It represents not ideology, but shared infrastructure, creating everyday encounters rather than symbolic gestures. Maybe like it was aimed with the now destroyed Jami Mosque Cemevi project that was destroyed in Ankara by the regime. I come to my conclusion, and I will briefly summarize the key findings of the analysis. First, the Hizmet case demonstrates that sustained polarization does not simply suppress civic engagement. It shapes it into different forms. In Turkey, polarization encouraged a civic repertoire centered on education, dialogue, service, and institutional pragmatism, practices designed to preserve cooperation in a hostile political environment. Second, Hizmet's relocation to Germany shows that such repertoires are not automatically transferable. They require institutional translation through legal formalization, transparency, public self-definition, and coalition building beyond the own diaspora. While this adaptation process involved friction, it also expanded Hizmet's civic capacity within a liberal democratic setting. Third, Hizmet illustrates how a faith-based civic actor grounded in Islamic ethics, yet firmly committed to pluralism and democracy, can contribute to social cohesion without pursuing political power. Its strength lies in bridge building, interreligious cooperation, and civic education, rather than political mobilization or confrontation. The key take-home message is democratic resilience depends not only on institutions and laws, but on civic actors like Hizmet that are able to translate ethical commitments into durable, non-confrontational infrastructures of cooperation, especially in societies facing growing polarization. As Max Weber famously put it, Politics is the slow boring of hard boards, but civil society helps to ensure that those boards do not break under pressure. And this is what Hizmet is trying to do. Thank you very much.
Real quick. Due to time, I'm not going to talk very much here, but I just want to mention one thing. You know, you mentioned the regression of Hizmet and how that happened, but it's also created change for the better. And I thought that was a good saying that you had. So thank you. All right, our next person up is Manaraj Sukhdavan.
Okay, I just had to make sure that it is afternoon, and so good afternoon, everybody. And I can safely say that all protocols observed from this morning and the previous sessions, so I'm quite comfortable to continue. Just by way of introduction, I think that's what the moderator asked us to do. I am the director for the Oxford Centre at the University of Pretoria for Religion, Public Life and Security. I'm also the professor in religion studies at the University of Pretoria. I'm also the adjunct professor at the University of Tehran in Iran, and recently served as a co-chair for the G20 Interfaith Forum in South Africa. So I wear a couple of hats, and now you can understand why I am so grey. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this platform with some esteemed colleagues that are here. And I hope I can do justice with my topic, which is the historical roots and contemporary causes of religion and violence, and as a subtext, glimpses into the Hizmet pathways to peace. Now, I need to read my slides very often, and just as part of introduction, I have 4 categories that I want to quickly go through in my whole presentation. It's first of all the introduction, where I'll give you a conceptual framework, some of the historical roots, contemporary causes of religious violence. Then we look at the Hizmet pathways to peace, and then of course I will conclude, and I might not be longer than what I anticipated I would be. Religious violence, and I think all of us are familiar with that, is a complex phenomenon that spans centuries and diverse societies. It doesn't focus only on one specific society. While religion often provides ethical guidance, community, and a foundation of peace, it also has been invoked to justify conflict. Importantly, such violence is not inherent in any faith tradition, but usually arises from a broader interplay of political, social, economic, and cultural factors. Now, I want to argue that the entanglement of religion and political power has historically amplified conflict by transforming faith into an instrument of authority, identity, and exclusion. And therefore, from the Hizmet perspective, religion should remain independent of state control and function primarily as a moral compass rather than a political tool. Thereby, I want to also suggest that it safeguards the capacity to nurture peace and human dignity. The Hizmet movement, this is just a small glimpse into the methodological note I want to talk about, is the Hizmet movement is engaged in an illustrative paradigm rather than as a normative template, or what I will also refer to as a prescriptive model. Its emphasis on education and the concept of Hizmet, which is service, interreligious cooperation, and the principled, I should say, separation of religion from state, as analyzed comparatively along what we would consider the Catholic peace and theology and the Buddhist traditions of nonviolence. In addition, I want to try and integrate insights from prior scholarships and interreligious praxis and enactment, particularly the emphasis on human-to-human engagement, and what I also speak about walking the talk as an orientation to peace building. If some of you are interested, you could follow an article which I published a few years ago, and it might interest you. It's called Religion, Religion, Wherefore Art Thou Religion? You know where all that comes from. If you're interested, you're welcome to read that article. So I want to argue that religion, understood as a human orientation towards the sacred and moral good, is not inherently violent. Rather, violence associated with religion emerges from the instrumentalization of faith within political, economic, and social struggles for power, territory, and identity. Within this broader analytical framework, this paper particularly gives attention to the Hizmet movement, inspired by the teachings of Fethullah Gulen, which maintains that religion should remain independent of state control and serve primarily as a moral compass for society, as we've heard from the previous speaker. Let's look at some of the historical roots. Now, the association between religion and violence must be situated within the broader historical context in which I believe political authority, economic power, and collective identity were frequently sacralized through religious language. Across civilizations, religion has rarely functioned in isolation from structures of power. Instead, it has often been embedded within systems of governance that shaped both social cohesion and conflict. From ancient empires, and this is a historical concept, to medieval and even modern states, religion and political authority have been mutually reinforcing. Religious institutions often legitimized rulers, while political elites protected and patronized dominant faith traditions. And we come from a tradition in South Africa, that's where I am from. And remember, at one time, the Calvinistic Christian theology dominated our whole political scenario and area. And this reciprocal relationship enabled political conflicts to be framed as sacred struggles, thereby intensifying the moral authority and emotional resonance. What about colonialism, modernity, and the sectarian grievance? Colonial rule, and I think here in India you suffered under the British Empire. Colonial rule profoundly reshaped religious identities by institutionalizing divisions as a mechanism of government. Now, beyond the Middle Eastern context, similar patterns are also evident in South Asia and sub-Sahara Africa. In British India, religious communities were categorized, codified, and governed through communal representation, reinforcing religious identity as a political category and intensifying Hindu-Muslim tensions. In parts of Africa, colonial regimes privileged certain religious groups in access to education, land administrative authority, embedding religious difference within enduring structures of inequality. These comparative trajectories demonstrate that religion-related violence is frequently a byproduct and externally imposed political orders rather than indigenous theological conflict. When religion becomes a proxy for access to power and resources, violence is more likely to erupt during moments of transition, decolonization, and regime change. What are some of the contemporary causes of religious violence? While historical grievances provide the structural backdrop for religion-related violence, contemporary manifestations are shaped by the interaction of political, ideological, and I want to throw in the word psychological, economical, and even technological dynamics. And these causes rarely operate independently. Instead, they reinforce one another, producing complex and persistent cycles of violence. What about the political manipulation and identity-based conflict? Now, in modern context, and I'm talking now very much about the contemporary situation, religion remains a potent, I should use that word, political resource. Political elites and movements frequently mobilize religious identity to consolidate power, delegitimize opponents, or frame violence as a defensive or sacred necessity. What about radical interpretation, ignorance, and miseducation? Now, from the Hizmet perspective, contemporary violence often stems less from excessive religiosity than from ignorance and miseducation. And I want to repeat that. From the Hizmet perspective, contemporary religious violence often stems less from excessive religiosity than from ignorance and miseducation. Rigid, literalist interpretations of sacred texts, detached from their ethical and historical context, can legitimize exclusion and aggression. And Gulen's emphasis on holistic education reflects a broader concern within religious ethics that moral formation must accompany intellectual instruction. Without critical engagement, and that's an important word, critical engagement, interpretive plurality, ethical accountability, religious knowledge risks becoming ideological rather than transformative. I will look now at the social economic inequality, marginalization, and grievance. Economic marginalization, unemployment, and social exclusion provide fertile ground for radicalization, particularly when reinforced by identity-based narratives of humiliation and injustice. In contexts where religious identity overlaps with economic deprivation, violence may be framed as a morally justified response to systemic inequality. Such framing obscures the structural origins of injustice while directing frustration towards symbolic, religious, and ethnic adversaries. What about the media, technology, and the acceleration of radicalization? Digital media has fundamentally altered the dynamics of religious violence. Online platforms enable the rapid dissemination of extremist interpretations, conspiracy narratives, and emotive imagery that bypass traditional religious authorities. Contemporary religious violence is best understood as the outcome of interlocking drivers rather than singular causes. Political manipulation amplifies identity insecurity at three fronts. First, socioeconomic inequality intensifies grievance. Ignorance, secondly, and miseducation weaken ethical discernment. And thirdly, digital media accelerates and spreads radical ideologies. And these factors interact in feedback loops that normalize violence and sustain this over time. From a Hizmet perspective, this synthesis highlights a central role of education, moral formation, and civic engagement in preventing violence, where individuals are equipped with critical thinking skills. Again, the word critical comes in, ethical literacy, and exposure to plural perspectives. The appeal of extremist narratives diminishes. Integrated peace-building strategies must therefore address both structural injustice and moral resistance. And I come to my final point, which is pathways to peace. A central contribution of Gulen's thought is his rejection of both the marginalization of religion to the private sphere and the political instrumentalization of religion. Gulen consistently distinguishes between a civil form of secularism that enables a participation of citizens of all faiths in public life and an ideological secularism that excludes religious voices altogether. Now, earlier, the claim that violence often emerges not from religion per se, but from distorted state-religion arrangements that foster resentment, exclusion, and reactive extremism. Gulem's emphasis on the Dar al-Hizmet, the land of service, provides a conceptual bridge between religious ethics and peace praxis. Rather than framing the world in a binary terms of Dar al-Islam or Dar al-Harb, Gulen advances a service-oriented vision in which Muslims contribute to social harmony through education, dialogue, and civil engagement. This resonates strongly with the Catholic peace theology that emphasizes solidarity and the common good, as well as the Buddhist traditions of compassion and non-harm, all of which prioritize lived ethical practice over ideological confrontation. And within the realm of Buddhism, one can, I should actually begin to say Hinduism, and then onto Buddhism, which preaches the whole idea of peace and compassion. Importantly, Gulem's condemnation of terrorism on unequivocally Islamic grounds strengthens the argument that religious traditions possesses internal resources for delegitimizing violence. His insistence that killing of innocents is categorically impermissible, even in conditions of war, aligns with just war critics within Christianity and with Buddhist commitments of ahimsa. The comparative value of the Hizmet-inspired approach lies not in its uniqueness, but in its convergence with other peace-orientated religious traditions. Like Catholic social teaching, it affirms the importance of human dignity, moral responsibility, and the restraint of power. Like Buddhist and Hindu nonviolence, it foregrounds inner moral transformation as a prerequisite for social service. Together, these traditions illustrate that sustainable peace is fostered through education, ethical critique, and interreligious cooperation rather than coercion or ideological domination. Well, how am I doing with time? Almost done. All right. When that goes, you must know. I need to keep quiet. 1 minute. It's a long time. Let me just speak very quickly as I conclude with this paper. Building on Gulem's insistence that religion must remain independent of state control, Hizmet understands faith primarily as a moral resource rather than a political instrument. This position resonates strongly with praxis-orientated models of interreligious engagement that prioritizes human dignity over doctrinal rivalry. I'm just going to skip to my conclusion. I think I've got a conclusion somewhere. Yes, I do. Religion possesses a dual capacity to inspire social justice and to legitimize division. Thus, this article has argued that violence associated with religion arises not from faith itself, but from its distortion with political instrumentalization, economic inequality, historical grievance, and ignorance. By reclaiming religion's ethical foundations through education, interfaith dialogue, social economic reform, and faith-based service initiatives such as Hizmet, alongside the Catholic and Buddhist and Hindu peace traditions, I believe religious communities can contribute meaningfully to peace building, recognizing religion as a moral compass rather than a political instrument remains essential for advancing peace coexistence in plural societies. I thank you.
Okay, so that was really good. I heard a couple different things in there. So religions should serve as a moral compass. Religion should serve as a moral compass. And we must nurture peace and human dignity, human to human engagement, that religion is not inherently violent. That was a strong statement there. That was good. So then you took us on a historical journey, which was very interesting, how violence is framed through different areas like economics and technology, and most important, kind of pathways to peace, and with Hizmet. So thank you. Okay, so next we have Miriam Zimmerman.
I'm very grateful to be here and would like to thank the selection committee, Mr. Betsad Fatmi, and Nurdin Kaparov and Mustafa Ulukaya of the Pacifica Institute for enabling me to be here today. Is this a mic that I have to be really close to? Can you hear okay? It's good here? Not too, okay. It is an honor to present dialogue as practiced by the Jewish-Palestinian Dialogue Group of the San Francisco Bay Area. Here you can see our founders. The group was founded in 1992. And I'll begin with this stereotype about us Jews. You put two of us together, and you'll get three opinions. A famous Talmudic principle, pardon me, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, describes this phenomenon. These and those are both the words of the living God. An example, two neighbors could not reach an agreement, so they took their case to the local rabbi. The rabbi listened to the first man's case, thoughtfully nodded his head and said, "You're right." He then listened to the second man's case, nodded and said, "You're also right." But the rabbi's assistant said, "No, Rabbi, they can't both be right." And the rabbi thought for just a moment and said, "You're right too." This parable is an illustration of that Talmudic principle. Judaism supports dialogue. Jewish tradition supports dialogue by its emphasis on the validity of diverse viewpoints. Elu ve'elu. You do not have to agree, but you have to listen to understand. Our dialogue group has an international reach. For example, in 2010, co-founders Len and Libby traveled to Nigeria for the second annual International Conference on Youth and Interfaith Communication. We have more. You'll have to go to the website. In the interest of time, I didn't include everything. We have presented panels in schools, cultural centers, houses of worship, and community organizations such as the Ramallah Club of San Francisco and the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Bay Area. Our most recent panel was at the Sonoma State University's first lecture in their 15-week annual lecture series presented by the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Education. The next day, we had an experiential workshop on the right, and the students had an opportunity to learn their own dialogue skills as we teach it. Such skills enable participants to have meaningful conversations around difficult topics, safely and without judgment. For us, dialogue begins with personal story. My story begins with my father, Werner Leo Löwenstein of blessed memory. With less than $5 in his pocket and having lost everything, Dad fled Nazi Germany in 1937. He was armed with two documents. One was his diploma from the University of Berlin Medical School in 1934, And the other was a letter of recommendation from the Mother Superior of a Catholic hospital in Cologne, where he did an internship. And it's interesting, as an academic, his medical diploma is actually written in Latin. He couldn't wait to become an American citizen so he could join the U.S. Army and return to Germany to fight the Nazis. He was part of Patton's Third Army as they advanced into Germany and fought he was in a medical battalion just behind the advancing American lines and was part of the Battle of the Bulge. Dad met and married my mother, Hazel Anderson, in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is my hometown. I don't want to say the hoo-hoo, I'm a Hoosier. Okay. Unusual for the time, Mother had a master's degree, and education was important to both my parents. Education, he said, as a man who lost everything was taken away from him. Education is something they can never take away from you. That was his German accented mantra. My husband and I have managed to pass on his mantra to our 3 adult children, all of whom have advanced degrees. And as a little girl, I loved going to St. Anthony's Hospital with my daddy on weekends. He would find a friendly nun to babysit me while he went to the hospital emergency room to see one of his patients. My mother was born and reared a Mormon in Utah, converting to Judaism when she married my dad. Her mantra also echoes in my ears. God doesn't care if you're a Jew, a Catholic, a Protestant, a Hindu, or a Buddhist, as long as you are a good Jew, a good Christian, a good Hindu, and so forth. I thought that was the way of the world until I went off to college, and then I learned at Northwestern University that that's not the way of the world. And now my story begins. When I appear on panels, I explain how I came to the Jewish-Palestinian Dialogue Group. Flash forward. For 35 years, I have been a Catholic educator. 9 years at the Jesuit-run University of San Francisco, where I earned my doctorate, and 26 years at Notre Dame de Namur University in Belmont, California. Being in Catholic institutions evoke comforting memories from my childhood, playing with the nuns at St. Anthony's. As a second-generation German Jew, the Holocaust became my professional as well as a personal focus. With a colleague, I introduced a semesters-long Holocaust class at NDNU. I taught it solo for 25 years and became a self-defined Holocaust Jew. Recently, I tried to explain to a non-Jewish friend what it meant to be a Holocaust Jew. I showed her my phone as I tried to type in the word audio, and after the first 2 letters, Auschwitz popped up. So I see the world through a Holocaust lens. The hollow-eyed, starving children of Gaza look no different to me than pictures of children during the Holocaust, suffering from starvation rations or no rations at all. Reports that many Gazans had no water, food, or electricity remind me of the Warsaw Ghetto before the uprising, when the Nazis turned the power and the water off randomly at will, and there was a shortage of everything. And now the rubble of Gaza looks to me like the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto after the uprising. Holocaust Jew, I refuse to be a bystander. I must speak out. My parents reared me to be a proud Jew, but I feel shame every time I read a report of the number of innocents killed in Gaza, creating families without children and children without families. Images of Gaza now leveled remind me of the German city of Dresden at the end of World War II, leveled by British and American bombs. Ethicists still debate, is the strategic bombings of cities during warfare ethical or a war crime? With cousins living in Tel Aviv and with a tremendous love for Israel, It is painful for me to hear the charge of genocide to describe what has happened and is happening in Gaza. I have tried to clarify my own feelings about this charge. I admit I am still working on it. In 1998, I received a fellowship from the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education at Seton Hill University to attend their summer institute in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, one of the holiest cities in the world for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. My spiritual IQ elevates 10 notches every time I enter the old city. My Jewish friends couldn't believe it. You're going to Jerusalem to study the Holocaust with Catholics? The center has a partnership with Yad Vashem in Israel, the world's Holocaust Remembrance Center. Okay. Most of our professors were from Hebrew University, except for Sister Gemma, the co-founder of the Catholic Center and the nun in charge of the Seton Hill group. Sister Gemma lectured on Vatican II and the subsequent reforms of the Catholic Church regarding Jews and other non-Christian religions. I was the only Jew in the Seton Hill group. Yad Vashem matched us with a group of Jewish Holocaust educators, and the two groups learned from each other as well as from the curriculum. On weekends that summer, Sister Gemma took our group to Christian sites. Although it was my fourth visit to Israel, I had never heard of Terra Sancta, the Holy Land for Christians. And I got whiplash on a bus tour of Jerusalem with my new Catholic friends. Who knew there were so many churches and Christian shrines in Jerusalem, often behind high walls? And over there, King Solomon built a temple to the Egyptian gods. What? The things Israeli guides don't tell Jewish groups. It turned out King Solomon, with 700 wives and 300 concubines, my grandchildren might be watching, so I'll move on, had just married an Egyptian princess. She wanted a place to pray to her gods. The accommodating bridegroom had a shrine built just for her. We retraced the steps of Jesus on the way to his crucifixion on the Via Dolorosa, pausing at the last half dozen or so stations of the cross. We were now in the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, a marketplace teeming with veiled Muslim women and children playing happily. A few darted through our group. At each station, Sister Gemma quickly found the relevant passage from her post-it note studded Bible. And after she read, they all sang a relevant hymn. Religion should not be a spectator sport, but watching them was contagious. At each station, their piety elevated my spirituality to ever greater heights. But at each station, our guide, Pau, a former monk turned archaeology professor at Ben-Gurion University, placed my spirituality on a seesaw. After all, we were an academic group, so we needed a scientific perspective. After the prayers and the singing, Pau pointed out that there was no archaeological evidence that Jesus stumbled here or that Veronica wiped his brow there. Besides, he added, Veronica is the Greek word for handkerchief, and probably there was no one named Veronica at that time. The scientific reality that this was all in their heads did nothing to stem the reverence of these praying pilgrims. However, Pau's scientific comments grounded my spiritual seesaw with a resounding thud at each station. And I wondered what the indifferent Arab shoppers thought, seeing this devout group of Christians praying and singing in some of the holiest sites of their tradition, but to them was simply a marketplace. As we threaded our way through the Arab quarter toward the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I felt a greater presence in a moment without language. which to this day I cannot describe in words. It was so profound for me. I spoke with a physicist who holds a PhD from the Technical University of Munich and lives in Munich with her family. I asked her to explain religious phenomena, trying to understand my own, what I deemed a religious experience from a physicist's point of view. And so, since this is an academic audience, we need grounding in science, just like following the footsteps of Jesus with an archaeologist. And I was proud of my question, having done a little research. Does string theory explain religious experience since it supports parallel dimensions? She immediately corrected my question. String theory, which is currently an untestable mathematical theory, proposes extraspatial dimensions, which are not quite the same as parallel universes. Even if parallel universes did exist, that wouldn't validate or invalidate religious experiences which operate outside the realm of reproducing. Is that 15 minutes? My 15 minutes of fame just ended. Which operate outside the realm of reproducible scientific experimentation. Thud. End of the scientific analysis of my religious experience. Full disclosure, the physicist is my daughter. Last page. Words finally surfaced. Following the footsteps of Jesus in Jerusalem brought me to Islamic Israel, which, like Christian Israel, I had never witnessed. And I realized that to understand the totality of my beloved Israel, I would have to reach out to a Muslim group to study and learn and return and find the sites that are holy to Islam. So after my return home, I tried to find a local Muslim group with whom I could study and learn, and ultimately go back to Israel with. Instead, the Jewish-Palestinian Living Room Dialogue group kept populating my searches, thanks to the new search engine, Google. It was 1999, the eve of the new millennium, and I discovered that co-founders, you saw them earlier, Libby and Len Traubman, he is now of blessed memory, and Nahida and Adham Salem lived just minutes from my San Mateo, California home. I called, and yes, there are Muslim members in the dialogue group. I joined, became active, served on panels, and gave presentations. Although I never did encounter Muslim Israel the way I experienced Christian Israel, I came to appreciate the Palestinian people and their profound historical connection to the land, which is often not taught to Jews. To conclude, it will take all three of us, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to build lasting peace in the Holy Land. Together, we must transform historic enmity into empathic communication. We must learn not only to see the image of God in one another, but also be the image of God reflected in the other. As a retired professor of communication, I am convinced that dialogue is the best way, and perhaps the only way, to create these connections. At last week's workshop, where we taught students how to dialogue in this way, one young man observed, quote, "Dialogue is like face-to-face humanity, a trust thing. It's comforting to know you can show up and be who you really are." A young lady pointed out, dialogue creates a safe space to be real. Wisdom from students. The Jewish-Palestinian Dialogue Group of the Bay Area has an ambitious agenda. We hope to create a public peace process in the Middle East, one student, one story, and one relationship at a time.
Thank you, Miriam, for talking about your dialogue group, and really enjoyed your parables that you started with, and how Jewish tradition supports dialogue on diverse viewpoints. And you said something that I thought was profound. You said you have to listen to understand. Story starts with dialogue. Right? Well, stories are powerful. Your family story is very powerful. Your story is powerful. And we actually have something in common. So guess what my dad told me? He said, Vanya, an education is something, exactly, right? Can you believe it? I've been told that in high school all the way through college. Nobody can ever take it away from you. Yeah.
Having a master's degree is a dropout in my family.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you, Miriam. Okay, so next we have Philip Clayton.
Backgrounds and cultures you represent. Incredible resource. So I'd like to pause and ask you to give yourselves a round of applause for what you as an audience represent in this room. Thank you. Well, we've had a chance to hear 3 approaches to dialogue so far. We've talked about dialogue in an era of democratic fragmentation. We've talked about pathways to peace and the role of dialogue. And lastly, the Jewish-Palestinian dialogue. What I'd like to close today's session with is an overarching proposal about the role of dialogue in Hizmet in this phase that we've moved into subsequent to 2016. And this is a chance for something new to come in how Hizmet volunteers and participants understand ourselves, and also at the same time an importance of holding on to what first defined the movement many, many years ago. That would be the core thing I want to communicate with the timer running in less than 15 minutes. So we face a challenge with those 2 terms that I just mentioned. First, increasingly, religion is seen not as the glue that holds a society or nation together, but as a source of division. How is Hizmet to serve as a source of unity, given that it arose in Turkey, was culturally Turkish, and was inspired by a gentle, wise Muslim imam, Fethullah Gulen? I come from a country where religion is now being used to dichotomize the nation which used to say one nation under God. And now, if you're evangelical, then for you, increasingly that means that you support a particular political party, a particular man, and whatever that man is saying. The other side is said to have lost its Christianity altogether, the progressives or liberals, and to have descended to a sort of weak-kneed Marxism, such that now this one gentle prophet, Jesus, has as a heritage 2 politically warring groups, which in threatening the stability of the United States, threaten global stability. Did I put that strongly enough? Right? So that's part of the challenge. At the same time, here's the challenge. Hizmet now presents itself as a transnational civic society initiative, which takes away the fear that it works to evangelize or to push Turkish self-interest around the globe. On the other hand, that phrase doesn't warm the heart the same way as friendship dialogue did. How do we handle this new situation that we face? What I want to do in the remaining 13 minutes is to talk about the 3 phases of Hizmet's history and to try to locate where we are today and how we should move forward, particularly in the area of dialogue. Phase 1 brought these 5 types of activity: service, interfaith work, friendship, dialogue and a focus on multicultural and multi-religious dialogues. What I'd like to do is to focus in on the example I know best, the Pacific Institute in Southern California, where I've been involved for the last 14 or 16 years. Now, we began with Turkish activities. So the Anatolia Festival would draw us about 45,000 people to a fairgrounds in Orange County every year. And people were drawn by the richness of Turkish culture and history. Then they began to engage in friendship dinners and other activities of Hizmet in Southern California. There was a strong draw to that. In the next phase, we moved on to interfaith friendships and friendship dinners. And I want to say that I know these primarily from the standpoint of bringing together leaders in a state. So in Colorado, in California, in Hawaii, in Alaska, in Wyoming, other states, the governor, many of the senators and representatives would come to a Hizmet dinner. And those were powerful. As a non-Muslim participating and speaking at these events, I realized what it was that made Hizmet so successful in reaching out in this form of friendship to people who had probably never been invited by a Muslim to a meal before, period. One was the people in the room, the Hizmet volunteers, the friends were so warm and welcoming, it was contagious, especially to a room full of politicians who are always trying to get something from someone else, right, tit for tat. That was one. The second one is they were clearly not evangelizing. They weren't pushing Islam. They were honoring the Christians and Jews in the room. And the third reason that was really clear is that the work that Hizmet volunteers did in that state was known by its leaders as supporting law enforcement, civic engagement, volunteerism, work with those neediest in society. That representation by Hizmet members, I can say from 7, 8, 9 different state governments, was powerful and transformative. A lot of those people then ended up going to Turkey and strongly supporting the work of Hizmet in that area. The Ramadan dinners, iftar dinners have also been and continue to be in the US as probably in other countries as well, powerful means of connecting. Look at the way that the Mosaic Multicultural Foundation described itself. First of all, multicultural foundation, harmony through dialogue, incredible way to describe it, and spoke of the friendship dinners as contributing to the progress of intercultural and interfaith dialogue and peace. That's the branding of phase 1 in Islam in the United States, and incredibly effective, as you may well know. Now, how do we respond to a radically new situation? It takes perhaps some new techniques, but also not losing the first ones. So this is the phase after the crisis, pictures and stories that many of you know only too well, when a military coup was blamed on a peaceful imam living in Pennsylvania and used as an excuse for incredible movement of persecution for Hizmet. Schools were closed, institutes were closed, massive universities, charitable organizations, assets were stolen from the people to whom they belonged, and at one point, over 50,000 people were imprisoned, as well as migrating to leave Turkey. That began this transition to Hizmet as a transnational civil society initiative. And what came out of that was the attempt to describe 12 values that civic society organizations can contribute to the common good of a nation, a people, a region. What this did was to take away the fear, actually to answer the challenge that Hizmet might have contributed to violence or political overthrow by saying, look, here are the values we actually represent. And those were presented in different ways, listing with descriptions. Many people worked with Alp and many other volunteers in formulating these at the time. In order to humanize them, then, we attempted to give an overall understanding. Dialogue is still written in large words, but here, the primary focus is on social cohesion, how Hizmet can contribute to the cohesion, the working together well, peacefully, of a group of people in any nation of the world. The mutual understanding, the person-to-person dimension, was not emphasized in that list so much. So we redid them to personalize them with pictures of people involved, but the same very general values were listed. Okay. Clearly it was important to focus on shared values, things that are shared across multiple religions and that help to be the glue that holds a society together. At the same time, this was a much more difficult product to offer in the building of relationships between human beings, religions, and culture, which is why I had you applaud yourselves in the beginning. So here you can see the more general set of values that became part of this second phase in the history of Hizmet. You can see, again, here they're listed at the top part, but look at the last sentence in the first paragraph. Concepts rooted in Islamic tradition and universal human values. You could say that the shift was to that latter phrase, and that the grounding in Islam was de-emphasized in this phase. Again, for reasons that made a lot of sense at the time. I agree that we can't go back from the 12 values. But how can we emphasize the deeper beliefs and values that motivate the work? Where is the role of service? And this is what I think leads us to the third phase, interfaith friendship and shared service as our contribution to civil society. Do you see how I'm trying to bring the two phases together? As actually in the previous session, Alp signaled that that work is actually already underway. So my proposal is to think of the expression, the motto maybe, rooted in faith, active in the world, in service of all. A social movement guided by the deeper values of Fethullah Gulen, of the history, and rejoicing in the resources that other faith traditions bring to that same dialogue. And what I want to do now is to just sort of remind you of the way that we spoke in the first part of the tradition, the sorts of expressions that were transformative for my life and the lives of many religious and non-religious people around the world. I think the reminder is important before I close. So compassion comes first. Imam Gulen said, the universe is woven out of compassion. What brings created things their essential beauty is compassion indeed. Humankind, compassion comes first. Depolarization we've heard a lot about already. But look at the religious reason for it. All knowledge belongs to God, and religion is from God. How then can the two be in conflict? I mean, there is a simple wisdom that communicates across cultures and nations and languages in that way of thinking. The third is democracy. Our challenge is to strengthen democratic institutions. He actually argued it's the only viable political system for humans today. A stronger statement than I'm hearing from the United States, for example. On terrorism and violence, a sentence I will never forget, and it should be on all of our websites. Terror can never be used in the name of Islam or for the sake of any Islamic ends. A terrorist cannot be a Muslim, and a Muslim cannot be a terrorist. We are representatives and symbols of peace. And finally, dialogue between the religions. I'll let you read it. That became the central focus. And so what I'd like to do in closing is to flesh out this proposal, rooted in faith, active in the world, in service of all. Why do we need to emphasize faith foundations? Because that's the living, breathing, human, divine side of the work. We can add to civil society that warm heart side of why we do what we do. So we use language of civil society movement, but we can emphasize that we're motivated by our faith as Muslims and Christians, as Hindus and Jews. We're not merely the one, but they're the product of a deep faith that lies at the core of our being. So the proposal, we can be more forthright about our religious motivations. Think about expressing the entire ladder of values. The values we live out in everyday practice, linked to the values in a city or nation, the core values of civil society, the 12, and then look at the root. The foundation are the religious foundations, the divine foundations for the actions that we take. The 12 principles by themselves don't sing, but when we add to them the sacred texts and stories of Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, and the texts of religions around the world, that draws the hearts of human beings. And finally, to show how we derive the values, and then we come as persons of faith to the civil society dialogue. Not suddenly finding ourselves with 12 universal values, but with our faith, our culture, our race, our national background, our own personal histories. That's the richness that we bring to that shared point. So the ladder of values, we need all four as they work together. And even with universal values, it's still about faith, about human beings, as we've heard in these stories, about children and adults, about contact, and in the end, about love and compassion. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Dr. Clayton, you talked about some challenges and how Hizmet is a transnational civic society leadership group. And also that we're in new times, right? We have new situations. And then you gave us a historical perspective. And then this one I was very interested in because I hadn't heard of this, but the Turkish festival, 45,000 people. All right, that's a lot. Representation, I could say, of Hizmet is powerful, and that's just a great example of. So I think what I'm going to do now, based on time, is I'm going to maybe take 2 questions. We'll see how it goes, and I know that lunch is coming, so let's see if I can take 2. I have one over here.
Thank you, 5 of you, beginning with Erkan. This challenge of authoritarianism and democracy also calls for a rethinking of the relationship between democracy, nation-state, and violence, and how authoritarian populism is accompanied by authoritarian centralization. About democratic resilience, it also needs to be accompanied by creative processes of resonance. And in political theory, time being short, very quickly, since all of you are emphasizing on civil society, the fundamental challenge is also rethinking civil society. And therefore, drawing work on Robert Bellah, his notion of civic religion, today, to understand Gulen's work, even the paradigm of civic religion is inadequate. How do we understand the dynamics of civic spirituality in a transnational context, accompanied by post-religious and post-secular transformations? And finally, Miriam, thank you so much. But Jerusalem is not only for the Jews, Muslims and Christians. What about the Druze? And the point is, what is the place of Jewish women in Jerusalem, where Jewish women are beating their head for inclusion? And how do we conceptualize Jerusalem today as a planetary Jerusalem? What kind of dialogue need to happen, for example, between Benares and Jerusalem? Thank you.
All right, do we have one more question? Okay, right over here. I'm not sure. I didn't see, okay.
Thank you so much. So my name is Hamisi. I'm from Tanzania. So I really wanted to ask on the talk about having education system that is inspired about dialogues and interfaith discussions. So my question is, how are we going to integrate those values in the existing education systems? How do we want to invent the wheel and having another education system? Thank you.
I appreciate, actually, to weave the two questions together because they bridge from dialogue, our theme, to education. But you ask about, Hamisi, you ask about education in a way that considers its dialogical potential. And so I see the two questions. The one thing I do want to respond to is civic religion, because if we said Hizmet only represents a civic religion and left out the prophets, left out the intensity of praying 5 times a day, of Ramadan, we would not include the richness of what Hizmet has to offer. And so I'm worried about the thinness of civic religion in contrast to the richness of the daily religious and spiritual life. Thank you.
Yes, I hope I understood your question right. And in terms of politics, I think Hizmet tried to establish something like a third way, because it tried to divide politics and, just as you also said, civil Islam. And I would see Hizmet as a representative of a civil Islam, trying not to bring justice or good education through politics or through parliament, but through education, service, and dialogue. So I think if you connect all these 3 elements, dialogue, education, and service, then you reach what Hizmet is aiming, to establish a society that is based on doing good and based on a society with trying to act with misbet hareket, what Hoca Effendi called, trying to act in a good way and in a humble way. And if you do this, I think you will find ways to reach also politicians and also the major society. And I think this is what Gülen for a lifetime also tried to do, because he reached out to politicians, yes, but as a civic actor, as a representative of civil Islam, and not as a representative of a political party. And I think this was also what made him so much famous in Turkey, because it was another way. Instead of politics, it was civil, it was coming from the people, it was not top down, it was bottom up. It was working on the human being and not on the state, the party, or the parliament.
I think just your question on a religion education, I can talk from the context of South Africa. One of these subjects we used to have in school was called religious education or religious instructions. And we have since moved away from that to talk about religion education, not religious education. And I think to us that has become very, very important. In other words, and so is the department that I'm in. You know, once upon a time it's called religious and biblical studies. Now we just call it religion studies, because religion as a phenomenon and an academic discipline in itself talks about how religion engages, not religions. I think that is where the problem comes in, especially among school children, because a teacher that teaches, for example, a Christian teacher that wants to teach Islam never works. So we try to use the term religion education, where we teach them about the fundamental ethics, the morals, that religion can be addressed in our curriculum. And I think if one looks at the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, I think that comes through very, very important and very strongly through. It's more about what affects you as a society, and maybe a bit of a different divergence from civic religion in that sense. So I think in that sense, we need to emphasize the concept of religion education rather than religious education.
Back to you, Chair.
All right, so based on of time here, I'm not going to give a close, but I think that all of you in the audience got a lot out of our panel. Thank you all very much for doing this today, and I believe it's lunchtime. So let's go to lunch.